Want to limit my food expenses to a limit? I will make sure I hit the limit every day. So, I am a business consultant, and usually during the week we are at client site and get paid for travel, meals, etc. The meal reimbursement policy is quite flexible, and doesn't limit what we can claim, like some of the other consulting companies. So, we can claim lunch, alcohol, whatever. The policy, however, does lay down a guidance for a daily limit for food expenses, based on the country where you're traveling. I capitalized the word guidance, since that is exactly how it is written in the policy. It is a guidance, not a hard limit. For the UK, where my current project is, the limit is £40 per day, which is mostly okay, but can be a bit low if you're in the center of London, for example. Now I do intermittent fasting, so most of the days I don't have breakfast and lunch, and just have one big meal a day, and have no problems keeping to the £40, usually around £20. On some days, I might go to a fancy restaurant, have a couple of scotches with a steak, and run up a $60 bill, but during the course of a 5-day week, my average meals would run about £30 a day, if not less. I've never had a problem claiming these expenses in my 9 years with the firm, but recently a new project manager, Red Bean Counter, came on board, and he sent back a couple of my expense reports for having meal expenses in excess of the £40 for a couple of days, even though the average meal expense over the week was much less than £40. I tried to reason with him, told him that anyway it was a guidance and not a hard limit, and I was keeping the costs down on other days. He refused to budge and said I could only claim £40 a day for food. So guess what? I started doing exactly that. Every day, I made sure I was claiming £40 or thereabouts for food. I started buying meals for the homeless people around the train station to make sure I could make up the £40. So now, where I was claiming less than £150 a week for meals, I now claim £200 and get some good karma for it. I went to dinner after work, gotta make sure to get the £40 worth of food in, and got back to thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments, gold, silver, front page, and God knows how many subreddits I've been added to. Thanks a ton, folks. Glad to see my little way of getting back at the man has given you some entertainment. Now to the comments. Went through the same thing couple years ago, but ours has limits on our meal per day. For example, $15 for breakfast and $20 lunch and $30 dinner. Most of the team we would usually skip breakfast and have cheap lunch on the go and have a nice dinner. So depending where you are at, it wouldn't be shocking to see something like this. Breakfast $0, lunch $7, dinner $45. We all got slapped on wrist pretty hard couple months in the row. So we all started maxing every meal, even it meant spending a little over and paying out of pocket, and even maxing breakfast at gas stations on road snacks. After a little while the rules were updated to give us a soft day limit for meals. That is just stupid. Our company did list 3 meals, but more in order to track receipts, as it is easier for them to enter them that way. The good way to get around that is by having a team meeting and listing it as a business expense rather than a personal meal expense. I had a boss who tried this and wouldn't budge. We ended up in a disciplinary with HR overseeing the discussion. HR found in my favor and asked me to leave. The boss was another 45 minutes before he did so. The company I work at used to have a daily limit on how much you can spend on food expenses when you travel, something like $70 per day. They noticed after a while a lot of people would try to actively spend the entire $70 limit on food each day, similar to what OP is doing. The limit was there kind of as a worst case scenario. It's like you can spend up to $70 a day on food, not you should be spending $70 on food each day. So, they ended up changing the food expense policy to not have any limits. It just says something like spend as you normally would when you eat out. It's really interesting because now it's like a personal moral limit that's in place. Saves the company money and it's pretty flexible. If you wanted to splurge one of the nights and get $100 just on a sushi dinner, no one would really care. I bet the vast majority of people actually regard that moral limit more stringently than they would a strict numerical one. Sure, There are probably a few people who splurge on someone else's dime, but they are probably not many of them, and you can call them in and say, "Wait a minute, I don't want you spending more than $70, or you may not order wine costing more than $10 a meal." There was a nursery that was having problems with late parents. They introduced a fine for every minute the parent was late for pickup. Even though they had now increased the cost of being late for the parents, the amount of late parents actually increased. By introducing the fine, the nursery had decreased the moral cost to the parents by telling them it's okay to be late, but you have to pay for it, whereas previously the parents knew they were doing something wrong by turning up late. I think this case is similar. Telling staff spend reasonably applies a moral cost to staff who think they are spending unreasonably. Telling them no more than X a day reduces the moral cost of spending just below X, even if it would previously seem an unreasonable amount. Fight the power. Also, it's really sweet you buy food for the homeless. Yeah, I would have just upped the scotch intake. OP sounds like a cool dude. When fasting for reasons of weight loss/general health, it's usually advisable to cut down on booze. Even liquor, which overall is actually quite health conscious, has downsides strictly due to consuming alcohol at all. I did this exact thing when my supervisor also tried imposing a limit, where the company policy literally stated it was a guideline and discretionary depending on the event. She rejected about $20 of my expense report because of one meal that went over, even though I was more than $10 under the so-called limit for every other day of the trip, and she would not budge even in light of that fact. I was incensed, to say the least. The thing was, not only was I normally falling well under the supposed meal limit, there were dozens of items that I normally left off of my expense reports out of sheer laziness, or, more accurately, an unwillingness to keep up with such trifles because of how time-consuming they were and how cumbersome our vastly antiquated expense reporting system was. Well, no more. From then on I hit every meal limit every single time, and no expense was too small to leave off my report. Plus, there were all kinds of things that I could quite reasonably, and legally, add to my expenses. By way of example, on my previous, 14-day trip, when they flew me to Alaska, my personal expenses and meals totaled exactly $308, not counting fuel for rental vehicles. I know this because, even though I have not worked for this company for more than 6 years, I still have all my old expense reports still sitting in my filing cabinet, now on my desk as I type this. Roughly 6 months later, and only 2 months after this disagreement over the $20, they sent me on the exact same 14-day trip, which was awesome because I got to experience Alaska in the dead of winter, and then smack dab in the middle of summer. But I digress. Again, not counting fuel, my personal expenses for that second trip totaled $804, a difference of $496 and a 161% increase. And it wasn't just this one trip. All of my expense reports more than doubled after her refusal to reimburse me for that $20. Prior to that event, excluding those 2 Alaska trips, my average reported expenses for the prior 3 months were $423 per month. For the 3 months following, they were $918, a 117% increase. The moral of the story being, don't duck with employees over expense report trifles. Why were you okay with spending so much of your own money before then? Did anyone take notice of the increase and ask you about it? I'm not OP, but I used to not claim mileage for driving in town to other sites. My company got nitpicky, and I claimed everything. 1 mile drive. That'll be 54 cents, guys. After hours or before hours work. Portal to portal mileage, thanks. 15% tip limit. I'll tip 15% on everything. In most stories of MC I'm like, man, duck your boss for whatever reason, but this instance with how you turned it into feeding the homeless, bro, That's a compliance I can get behind. Yeah, that's ingenious. What a way to turn it into something that produces good in the world, instead of eating it themselves, or throwing it out.